There's a small camera mounted on a streetlight in Kampala, Uganda. It looks like any other security camera you'd see in an American parking garage. It isn't. That camera is part of a system that used facial recognition to identify and help arrest more than 800 supporters of an opposition political leader. It was built, installed, and is maintained by a Chinese company. And it's not an isolated case. It's one node in a surveillance network that now operates in at least 12 African countries, all running on technology from a single company most Americans only know as the brand behind a banned smartphone. That company is Huawei, and the camera in Kampala is the smallest, least expensive piece of a strategy that has made China the single most important economic and infrastructure partner for nearly every government on the African continent. Since 2013, China's Belt and Road Initiative has poured a cumulative $1.4 trillion into infrastructure and investment projects across more than 150 countries, and Africa has consistently ranked among the top regions receiving that money. Chinese companies have built more than 6,200 miles of railway, nearly 62,000 miles of roads, almost 900 bridges, and close to 100 ports across the continent since the year 2000. Chinese firms, primarily Huawei and CTE, built roughly 70% of Africa's entire 4G telecommunications network. 70% of the network that 1.4 billion people use to call their families, run their businesses, and access the internet. And while the United States spent the last decade debating whether foreign aid to Africa should keep flowing at all, China was laying fiber optic cable, building railroads, financing ports, and putting facial recognition cameras on streetlights. One deal, one country, one decade at a time. In this video, we're going to break down exactly how China built this position: the railways, the ports, the data cables, and the surveillance systems. We'll explain the debt that comes attached to many of these deals and what happened when one African nation couldn't pay it back. We'll show you the new battlefield underneath all of this, the cobalt, copper, and lithium that the entire clean energy economy depends on. And we'll explain why, for the first time in over a decade, the United States is actually trying to compete, and whether it's already too late. But here's the question that matters most, and almost nobody in Washington is asking it out loud. It's not whether China is investing in Africa, that's obvious. It's what China gets in return for every dollar it spends. Because the answer isn't just roads and railways. In at least one country, the answer was a military base.
To understand why China is spending more money in Africa than almost anywhere else on Earth, you need to understand two things most people get wrong: what Africa actually has and what the West actually offers in comparison. Start with what Africa has. The continent holds roughly 30% of the world's proven critical mineral reserves, the raw materials that power smartphones, electric vehicles, wind turbines, and every battery on Earth. The Democratic Republic of Congo alone produces about 70% of the world's cobalt. South Africa accounts for roughly 75% of global platinum group metals. Zambia and the DRC are major copper producers. Guinea holds about a quarter of the world's bauxite reserves, the raw material for aluminum. If you've ever wondered where the materials inside your phone, your laptop, or your neighbor's electric car actually come from, there's a good chance the answer starts in Central or Southern Africa. China figured this out decades before most Western governments took it seriously. Chinese companies now control somewhere between 41% and 50% of African cobalt production, including 15 of the Democratic Republic of Congo's 19 cobalt mining operations, and roughly 30% of African copper production. China itself processes and refines more than half of the world's critical minerals, meaning even raw materials mined by other countries often get shipped to China to be turned into something usable. Now here's the part that explains why African governments keep saying yes to Chinese money. For decades, financing from Western countries and institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, and USAID, came with conditions: governance reforms, human rights benchmarks, transparency requirements. Those conditions exist for understandable reasons, but to a government that needs a port built in 3 years, not after a decade of policy negotiations, those conditions are an obstacle. China's pitch is different. Chinese state banks offer loans, often backed by the very resources, oil, copper, cobalt, that the infrastructure is built to extract and export. No requirements about how the country runs its elections, no conditions about press freedom or judicial independence. Just, here's the money, here's the construction crew, let's start building. Since the year 2000, China has provided cumulative loans of more than $143 billion to African nations, making it the continent's largest bilateral creditor. Half of that lending happened in just the 4 years before 2018, and the financing has continued accelerating since. China's Export and Import Bank and China Development Bank, both state-owned, are the primary engines behind that lending. Institutions that don't answer to shareholders demanding quarterly returns and don't answer to a Congress that has to approve every dollar. Trade between China and Africa surged from roughly $1 billion in 1980 to $128 billion in 2016 and has only grown since. China surpassed the United States as Africa's largest trading partner back in 2009, and the gap has widened every year since. Meanwhile, the American approach to Africa has been inconsistent at best. The African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, has provided duty-free access to the U.S. market for more than 1,800 African products since 2000, but AGOA has repeatedly faced uncertainty about renewal, was only reauthorized through the end of 2026, and its longer-term future remains unclear. The Trump administration's own foreign aid cutbacks in 2025 and 2026 created a vacuum across the continent, and China has consistently been the actor filling it. One senior Trump administration advisor for Africa, businessman Masad Bolis, defended the aid cuts by arguing that Africans don't need charity, they need business deals. It's a fair point in theory. The problem is that while Washington debates the philosophy, Beijing keeps signing the contracts. So China is winning on infrastructure and minerals, but there's a third layer to this strategy that almost never makes the news, and it's the one that should worry anyone who cares about how authoritarian governments operate. It's not about roads or copper. It's about who controls the cameras, the data, and the networks that 1.4 billion people now depend on every single day.
Let's break down exactly what China has actually built across Africa, because the scale only makes sense once you see the individual pieces. The physical backbone. Start with the basics: roads, railways, ports. The Mombasa-Nairobi Standard Gauge Railway in Kenya, built largely by Chinese financing and Chinese contractors, transformed a journey that used to take most of a day into a few hours. The Addis Ababa to Djibouti Railway connects landlocked Ethiopia to a seaport, giving one of Africa's fastest-growing economies a direct line to international shipping. China is currently funding a $1.4 billion upgrade to the Desire Railway, connecting Zambia and the Democratic Republic of Congo's mineral-rich regions to the port of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. Each of these projects follows the same basic pattern. A Chinese state bank provides the loan, a Chinese state-owned construction company bills the project, and the host country repays the loan, often using revenue generated by the resources that the new infrastructure helps export. It's not charity. It's a closed loop, and China sits at every point in that loop except the one labeled borrower. Now, the part that's harder to see because it doesn't look like a railway, it looks like a phone signal. Huawei and ZTE built approximately 70% of Africa's 4G network infrastructure. Huawei alone has launched 5G networks in South Africa, with Kenya's largest telecom operator, Safaricom, moving toward Huawei's 5G technology. Huawei Marine has helped deploy a 12,000-kilometer undersea cable system. That's roughly 7,500 miles, connecting Africa to Asia, one of several major undersea cable projects Chinese companies have built or financed across the continent. Think about what that actually means in practice. If you're a government official, a business owner, or an ordinary citizen anywhere in sub-Saharan Africa using a smartphone today, there's a very good chance the signal reaching that phone passed through equipment built by a Chinese company, financed by a Chinese bank, running on a network where Chinese technicians frequently handle maintenance and upgrades. The Safe City product. Here's where the story moves from infrastructure into something more uncomfortable. Huawei sells something it markets as the Safe City Initiative, a complete package of surveillance cameras, facial recognition software, and artificial intelligence analysis tools sold to city governments as a crime-fighting and traffic management solution. It's not a custom system built once. It's a product sold and installed in roughly 700 cities and regions worldwide, and at least 12 African countries have integrated into it. Uganda's deal is the most thoroughly documented. The Ugandan Police Department spent $126 million on CCTV cameras and facial recognition software from Huawei. Ugandan officials and journalists have confirmed that the system was used to identify and help arrest more than 800 supporters of opposition leader Bobi Wine. Reuters and the Financial Times both independently confirmed the Ugandan government's use of Huawei facial recognition technology for this purpose. Kenya, Zambia, South Africa, Nigeria, and Egypt have all deployed similar Chinese-built surveillance systems in recent years. In Zimbabwe, in the middle of a politically fraught transition away from Robert Mugabe's decades-long political dictatorship in 2018, the government signed a deal with a Guangzhou-based company called CloudWalk to build an AI facial recognition system specifically for use by security and police forces. A March 2026 investigation by Rest of the World, a nonprofit newsroom focused on technology outside the West, found that Chinese companies and banks are now behind the majority of Africa's AI-powered surveillance infrastructure, with at least $2 billion spent across the continent on this technology, and Nigeria alone spending roughly $470 million on Chinese surveillance systems, the largest network of smart cameras of any country studied. To be clear about what these systems are, Huawei's same Safe City platform operates in Xinjiang, the region in northwest China where the government has detained an estimated 1.5 million Uyghur Muslims and other minorities in what international human rights organizations have characterized as mass internment camps. The exact same surveillance architecture being sold to African city governments as a public safety tool is the architecture used domestically by the Chinese government for population control of an ethnic minority. There are legitimate, documented security reasons some African governments give for adopting this technology: rising urban crime rates in South Africa, terrorism concerns in Kenya. Those concerns are real, but the technology comes from a single foreign supplier with no meaningful international oversight, no independent audit of how the data is stored or who can access it, and a track record, confirmed by multiple governments' own admissions, of being used against political opposition, not just criminals. The final piece connects all of this back to the minerals we discussed in Act 2. China doesn't just want roads and 5G towers built. Those things make it easier and cheaper to extract and transport the resources Chinese industry depends on. The Kamoa-Kakula copper mine in the Democratic Republic of Congo, currently producing over 430,000 tons of copper annually, with the potential to reach 2 million tons by 2030, sits at the center of exactly this strategy. Chinese finance infrastructure, built specifically to move Chinese-controlled minerals out of the African interior and onto ships bound for Chinese ports and processing facilities. Now, none of this comes free. China structures these deals as loans, and when a country can't pay, China doesn't just write off the debt, it collects. And one small country in the Horn of Africa shows you exactly what that collection looks like, because it didn't end with money. It ended with the People's Liberation Army's first overseas military base.
Djibouti is a small country on the Horn of Africa, with a population smaller than the city of Seattle. Its strategic value has nothing to do with its size and everything to do with its location. It sits directly on the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, one of the most important shipping choke points on Earth, where a massive share of the world's oil and container traffic passes between the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. China financed the development of the port of Djibouti through loans from Chinese state-owned banks. Those loans, combined with other Chinese financing, eventually accounted for 56% of Djibouti's entire external debt. 56% of everything that small country owed to anyone, anywhere, was owed to China. In 2014, Djibouti agreed to allow the People's Liberation Army to establish a military presence at the port. That facility was completed in 2017, China's first overseas military base anywhere in the world. It sits a few miles from Camp Lemonnier,
the largest permanent U.S. military installation in Africa, home to roughly 4,000 American troops and the headquarters of U.S. counterterrorism operations across East Africa. The Pentagon doesn't have to speculate about why a Chinese naval base ended up a few miles from one of America's most important counterterrorism hubs in the region. The debt came first, the base came after. Djibouti isn't an isolated incident. It's a pattern that Western analysts somewhat clumsily call dead trap diplomacy. The World Bank flagged in 2024 that roughly 40% of low-income countries globally, including many across Africa, are either in or approaching debt distress, with Chinese loans playing a significant role. Angola, Zambia, Kenya, Ethiopia, and Egypt represent the largest concentrations of Chinese lending, and Angola alone accounts for roughly 27% of all Chinese loan commitments to Africa since 2000. Zambia provides the clearest cautionary tale. China became Zambia's single largest official creditor, holding $5.7 billion in claims. When Zambia defaulted on its debt in 2020, the restructuring negotiations dragged on for years, with Beijing using its position as the dominant creditor to shape the terms of how and whether Zambia's economy could recover. To be fair to China, and to avoid the kind of one-sided narrative that doesn't actually help anyone understand the situation, not every Chinese-financed project in Africa is a trap, and not every African government that takes Chinese money ends up worse off. Chinese investment has built real roads, real railways, and real power plants that genuinely improve daily life for millions of people who had no alternative source of financing. Many African leaders argue, reasonably, that the West offered conditions and lectures for decades, while China actually showed up with cash and construction crews. That criticism has merit. But the Djibouti pattern, debt leading to strategic leverage leading to a foreign military foothold, is exactly the kind of outcome that should concern anyone evaluating whether the West has a viable alternative to offer. Is the United States doing anything about this? As of 2025 and 2026, the answer is, finally, yes, though late and at a much smaller scale. The most significant American countermove is the Lobito Corridor, a $6.1 billion rail and infrastructure project backed by the US and the European Union, running from Angola's Atlantic coast through the Democratic Republic of Congo to Zambia's copper-rich region. It's explicitly designed to give African mineral exports a path to market that doesn't run through Chinese-controlled infrastructure, with completion targeted for 2030. In December 2025, the United States signed a strategic partnership agreement with the Democratic Republic of Congo, establishing what is called a strategic asset reserve, designated mining zones where American companies receive preferential treatment for new projects. That's a direct, explicit attempt to claw back ground in a country where Chinese companies currently control more than 72% of copper and cobalt mining operations. In February 2026, Secretary of State Marco Rubio hosted representatives from dozens of countries, including the G7, specifically to discuss forming what officials called a strategic mineral alliance, an attempt to build supply chains for critical minerals that don't depend on China. These are real concrete moves. They represent more sustained American attention to African resource competition than the previous 2 decades combined. But the scale gap remains enormous. China's cumulative Belt and Road engagement across Africa and the broader developing world has reached $1.4 trillion since 2013. The Lobito Corridor, the DRC Partnership, and the Mineral Alliance together represent a fraction of that, single-digit billions against trillions, decades of established relationships against a strategy that's barely 2 years old. And the digital and surveillance infrastructure question hasn't really entered the policy level of conversation at all. There is no major American or European competitor to Huawei's Safe City product being marketed at comparable scale or price across the African continent. China didn't just win the infrastructure and minerals competition first. In the realm of digital infrastructure and surveillance technology, there often wasn't a competition to begin with. Here's the number that should reframe how you think about all of this. Africa holds 55% of the world's cobalt reserves, the mineral every electric vehicle battery on Earth depends on.
but captures less than 1% of the economic value generated from the clean energy technology that cobalt makes possible. China didn't just build the roads, it built the entire pipeline that decides who gets rich from what's underneath those roads. And right now, that pipeline runs almost entirely toward Beijing.
A camera on a streetlight in Kampala, a railway connecting a landlocked country to the sea, a copper mine in the Democratic Republic of Congo feeding a Chinese-controlled supply chain, a naval base in Djibouti that didn't exist until the debt did. None of these are separate stories. They're the same story, told at 4 different scales. Over the past 2 decades, while Western governments debated aid conditions, human rights benchmarks, and whether engagement with Africa was even a foreign policy priority, China built railways, financed ports, wired 70% of a continent's mobile network, and sold surveillance systems to governments that wanted to watch their own citizens more closely than their own budgets could otherwise afford. China surpassed the United States as Africa's largest trading partner in 2009. It became the continent's largest bilateral creditor sometime in the years that followed. And as of 2026, it controls a share of the critical minerals that the entire global clean energy transition depends on. Minerals mined in Africa, refined in China, and turned into batteries and solar panels that get sold back to the rest of the world at a markup Africa rarely sees a meaningful share of. The United States is finally responding. The Libido Corridor, the DRC mining partnership, the push for a critical minerals alliance among allied nations. Whether that response arrives in time at sufficient scale to offer African nations a genuine alternative rather than a token counteroffer is the question that will define the economic map of an entire continent for the next generation. Africa isn't a charity case in this story, and it never was. It's the largest remaining frontier of untapped resources in growing markets on Earth, and the country that secures durable, trusted partnerships there first will hold a structural advantage that compounds for decades. Right now, that country is China, not because it offered more, because it showed up first, stayed longest, and asked the fewest questions. Subscribe to World Shift and turn on notifications. Every week, we bring you the stories that are too important to ignore and too complex to fit in a headline, explained clearly, backed by verified facts, with nothing invented. Understanding what's coming starts today. We'll see you in the next one.